for inviting me here to share some of my work with you. What I'll do is I'll give a kind of a talk. What we'll do is I'll just share some of the work that I've been doing with our group, Jamia Teachers Solidarity Association. What we've been documenting for the past at least 5 or 6 years. And I'll basically tell you some stories, and then maybe we can kind of draw some conclusions out of those. And the idea is to look at the kind of narrative of terrorism that one sees in the mainstream media, and to see the other side, behind these sensational headlines and these bombastic music and, एक आतंकवादी पकड़ा गया, धर पकड़ा गया और इतना RDX पकड़ा गया उसके साथ. Behind these sensational headlines, what really goes in, and what I'll try and do is to look at the various actors which are involved in this whole process of creating this narrative, and let's try and deconstruct some of these. And the major, one can call them the actors of the counterterrorism narrative. One can identify the investigating agency, the police, the special cell, the ATS, the crime branch, the greyhounds, and so on and so forth. Every state has its own agency. Plus you have the National Investigating Agency, the NIA now. There's that. Then there are of course the prosecutors and the judges, the judicial system. Then you have the media, very important, which actually creates this whole, which kind of systematizes and, out of this hazy details emerging from the prosecuting and the police agencies, creates this very well-concealed narrative of who is the terrorist, what is the terror, which are the terrorist groups, what are they doing, and so on and so forth. So now, let's try and look at some of, I'm going to discuss some, just share some stories with you, some cases that we have been documenting. We've documented cases from the special cell. In fact, in 2012, we brought out this report called Framed, Damned and Acquitted, which looked at 16 cases of terrorism, where the special cell had claimed that these, the accused, the people whom they had arrested were either, operatives of Houthi or LET or some such Al-Badr, and most of them were Kashmiri, Pakistan-trained Kashmiri militants, which is a headline that you will hear read very, very often in various newspapers. So we started to look at these cases, and what we found was that in case after case, and these were cases that basically what we did was we didn't have an idea about how to collect these cases. We had just these vague, one would read a little story or a snippet buried somewhere in page 13 or 14 in the daily paper, which said another terrorist let off for lack of evidence. You will find these stories quite regularly, that Houthi militant was acquitted for lack of evidence. Prosecution could not produce evidence. So we started looking at these cases. And what we found was that it wasn't just for lack of evidence that these people were being let off or acquitted. It was actually the courts were finding, and the courts were saying, and in this report we did not interview any of those who were acquitted, we did not interview the families, we did not interview the defense lawyers. What we did was just to look at the judgment of the sessions courts, and we found that the judge was saying that not only is there no evidence, but whatever evidence is there has been systematically manufactured by the special cell. So we found, in case after case after case, we found that all the FIRs were identical. You would find one simple narrative which would fit all the FIRs. For example, all FIRs would begin by saying, secret information was received in the police station. The secret information was pertaining to some militant who is about to enter the city of Delhi. He will be carrying arms, ammunition, RDX, and whatever you have. And we developed this information, we set up surveillance, we set up electronic surveillance and so on. We developed this information, and we found that this militant or this operative is coming to town on XYZ date. So we set up, So we got this secret informer to come with us to identify this militant. Now the secret informer, when we saw this militant, the secret informer pointed out to that militant, and thereafter we called out to him. He refused to surrender, and we kind of dhar the bojo him. That's the story. That is in every single FIR you will find the story. There are some minor variations. Sometimes it will be at a bus station, at the Kashmiri Gate bus station, at the Mukarba Chowk bus station. Sometimes it will be at the railway station. But I mean, that's how far their creativity will go. Beyond this, even they kind of don't realize where to go. So every single FIR we found had similar, stories about the secret informer, about whom no detail was ever present. There was no information about who the secret informer was, what kind of information, what grade of information was being received, and so on. So now the courts found that despite the fact, by the police's own admission, the special cell's own admission, that they had advance information about this militant coming in, they made no attempt to include any, public witnesses. Despite the fact that there were these so-called arrests were made in, railway stations or bus stations, or maybe some 15 kilometers away from the special cell office. And on the way, on this whole stretch of 15 kilometers, there were several government offices. The special cell made absolutely no attempt to include any public witnesses in their search and raid operation and their operation. So now, and of course, the special cell would say that, we asked bypassers to join us in our search, but they went away without giving us their addresses and names and phone numbers, so we couldn't do anything. So this was one. Secondly, in every single case, the police would say that, the special cell would say that we have recovered these, when we caught this fellow getting off from this bus at Mahipalpur Chowk, we found that he was carrying these 2 bags, and they were full of explosives, and 6 lakh rupees or 7 lakh rupees, or these arms were recovered. Now, despite the fact that you're catching somebody red-handed carrying all this cash and explosives and so on, you make no attempt to find the source of this. That there is no further investigation ever in these cases. वो पकड़ लिया बस हो गया. That's the end of the story. No further investigation to find out where this 6 lakh or 7 lakhs came from, where this RDX or ammunition came from, and that's the end of it. Now, in one of another case which is not included in this report, but which is going to be in a report that we are just bringing out the second edition of this report. And in that this case, the special cell claimed that they had actually caught somebody with 1.5 kgs of highly explosive TNT, which is highly combustible, one of the most explosive substances known to man. And then and the police also says when the court asked the special cell to produce it in the court, because they only had that 1 or 2 grams which was seized as sample. So when the court said, but where is the rest of the 1.5 kg of TNT? They said, oh sorry, there was a fire in the Malkhana, and the TNT evaporated. That's the kind of evidence that is being produced in court. That TNT evaporated, and this highly explosive chemical evaporated instead of catching fire when the Malkhana caught fire. So that's the kind of and these are really serious terror cases that we are talking about. So all, very similar kind of. There was a systematic kind of pattern that one saw to these fires. But we've also done documented cases from Rajasthan, from Madhya Pradesh, and elsewhere. And it seems that all agencies are kind of afflicted with this disease of manufacturing terrorists. Now, one of the most common logics which is kind of given on television among the commentary is that, but the police is under so much pressure, they have to crack the case, so they must do something. So, kabhi, these mistakes happen that, sometimes, under the pressure of media, under the pressure of politicians, the police will sometimes, try and, for quick results, they will, take shortcuts and do this. But the point is, if you look at a large number of these so-called terror cases, you will find that they are not connected at all to any event of violence which has taken place, as a result of which there might be pressure on them to perform in such a manner. A large number of these, in fact, I would say overwhelmingly, the cases booked under now the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act across the country do not have any basis in any actual event of violence, whether it's a bomb blast or whether it's firing or any other incident of violence. Now, when we went to Madhya Pradesh to there were a series of arrests in 2011, 2012. So we went to Madhya Pradesh, and we were trying to look at this series of arrests. But what we were confronted with was a huge number of cases booked under UAPA across district. In every district of Madhya Pradesh, you will find several cases, several people, several young men, Muslim men, arrested under Unlawful Activities Prevention Act for being members of Student Islamic Movement of India. Now you know that SME, Student Islamic Movement of India, or SME, was banned in 2001, just days after 9/11 in the US. And they were banned, and it said, that they were actually, it's almost like a response here that to what was happening in the US. So they were banned here by government notification, and immediately, right after the ban, the ban happens in the morning, is notified in the morning, and in the evening you see these, large number of arrests taking place across the country. People who had copies of the SIMI, magazine, they were arrested, or office bearers who had copies of SIMI, receipt books or membership slips and so on were arrested in the evening. So for material that was perfectly legal an hour ago, was deemed to be, unlawful, evidence of unlawful behavior. So if one really looks at this whole, and I'll come to just in a bit to how evidence is kind of created in these cases. But if you look at the law itself, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, what does it say? It says that an organization can be deemed to be unlawful by the executive. So the government will decide which organization is to be lawful and which organization is not to be lawful. And it is entirely on the subjective bias of the government that an organization gets labeled as unlawful. But even if, so far so good. So the government will say that SIMI is unlawful, but RSS is perfectly lawful. Bajrang Dal is lawful, Ram Sena is lawful. Now there's Hanuman Sena also, which is there in Karnataka. So all of these different Senas are lawful, but SIMI should be declared unlawful. Even so, now how do you prove that somebody is and how do you prove that somebody is engaging in unlawful activities? So the law will say that you are engaging in unlawful activities by being member of an unlawful organization, that you are furthering the activities of that organization. But how do you prove it? Because an organization which doesn't exist, which has been banned and been pushed into the underground, so to say, how do you prove that somebody is a member of that organization? So very interesting. You have, in case after case, you have magazines being seized, as I was saying, receipt books. Now, over a period of time, what happened was 2000, the ban happens. 2000, 2002, 2003, 2004, all of these years, continuously across the country, you will find cases being booked under UAPA against Muslim men for participating in unlawful organization called SIMI. And what is the evidence? The evidence is that they had copies of Islamic Movement, which was the official magazine of SIMI, copies of receipt books, copies of some other documents belonging to SIMI. Now, over a period of time, we find that, especially in Madhya Pradesh, this is the trend that we found. By 2011 and 12, the police had probably run out of these copies. So they started photocopying. So you find photocopies of, the back page of, say, Islamic Movement being produced as a SIMI parcha, which was being distributed by the accused. So this is how you create the idea of somebody participating in the unlawful. And it would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic and real lives were not involved. But I just want to give you as an example some of the incriminating material that had been seized by the Solapur city police. This was the Diwan of Ghalib, the collected poetry of Mirza Ghalib. And they said, oh, look at this particular couplet, it certainly is a jihadi couplet. And this was मौजे खून से सर गुजर ही क्यों न जाए, आस्ताने यार से उठ जाए क्या. Says even if a wave of blood were to pass over my head, it's not as if I would get up from my beloved's door. And this couplet was shown to be jihadi couplet because it's talking about wave of blood, violence. So obviously this must be jihadi couplet. Mirza Ghalib must be definitely an ideologue of jihad, and the person who possessed this copy of Ghalib's Diwan must be totally radicalized Islamic terrorist. So that's the kind of evidence that is being produced. Now, let me just share actually a couple of cases with you, about and from Madhya Pradesh. So this case, the kind of evidence that, so there's this, I mean again this case is a very, very, very kind of famous case. It's called the Khandwa conspiracy case. And several careers were in the police were made out of this case. People got promotions and so on. The police investigating officers who were part of this case, they were all promoted to great ranks. Now, in this case, again, there was no violence. No violence was alleged. In fact, in the cases we documented, I think about, we documented about 80 cases from Madhya Pradesh. Not one of them pertain to a case of violence. All of them were conspiracy cases, that these people were conspiring, they were hatching a conspiracy, and they were furthering the activities of SIMI by distributing pamphlets. But if you look at the FIRs, it's almost like these people had some kind of a death wish. The FIRs will go, secret information was received that Mr. XYZ, the accused, is standing at the bus stop and screaming madly that, so what if the government has banned SIMI? I will continue to be a member of SIMI. I will continue to spread the message of SIMI. I will continue to be an office bearer of SIMI. SIMI will never be, the government may ban it, but SIMI is never going to die, and I'm going to, take it forward and so on. So it's almost like the person is being possessed by some death wish. In FIR after FIR, you will find the same. That after the SIMI was banned, somebody was shouting and screaming in the public market, and very conveniently also had, stashes of SIMI parchas and posters in his pocket, so that the police could very conveniently go and arrest him right then with evidence. So that's the kind of evidence that we found. Now in this case, which also brings me to the point of judiciary as to what has been the response of the judiciary. Now if you look at this case, which goes back to 2006, there was no case of violence. It just again says that secret information was received that that 2 or 3 men are distributing SIMI parchas or pamphlets in a locality, and we went there and we arrested them, and then they said to us, they said to the police that, oh, we've got some other friends who are also engaged in the same activity, why don't we take you to their houses and you'll be able to get a lot of evidence. So then they go there. Then these 2 people whom the police has gone to, they say, oh, we have got some more friends whom we can take you to. So this way, and the Khandwa police goes to, travels to different localities of Khandwa, then goes to Kota in Rajasthan, then goes to Azamgarh in Uttar Pradesh, then goes to, Jabalpur and other places. Arrest whomever it can. For example, it went to Azamgarh, it went after Falahi, the former General Secretary of SIMI. He wasn't at home, so they came back. And it was just that, there was no further investigation. If they had, some, hunch about him having been involved in anything, they didn't go back and investigate. So जो हाथ लगा उसको पकड़ लिया, जो हाथ में नहीं आया, forgot about it. So they went to Kota. By the end of it, they had some 14-15 people who'd been arrested. Now, in this case, the evidence again was that we went to their house and we had these sackloads of books which we have recovered from them. There was no witness. All the eyewitnesses were very interesting. One of the eyewitnesses was the local Bajrang Dal leader. The second eyewitness to the recoveries was somebody who had a criminal case lodged against him in the same police station. The case was going on in the Kotwali police station, and he was the main accused of, I think it was some car theft case. So this main accused in the car theft case is the second witness. The third witness is a young drug addict who then comes to the court and says that I never went anywhere. The police came and made me sign blank sheets of paper. The court disregards it. Then this young boy, is picked up by the police a few months later, tortured and illegally detained in the police station. He commits suicide after a while. And all of this is in the papers. It's being reported in the local dailies. It has been brought to the notice of the court, but the court continues to say that I will not believe his testimony that he was forcibly made to sign those panchnamas and so on. So that's the kind of witnesses which the court is accepting in this case. And the other evidence is also very interesting. Now, as I said, that the only evidence in this case was the recoveries that were made by the police. Now, as I already said, the recoveries are usually semi-documents or any other thing. But in this case, and there were two girls who were arrested in this, two sisters, Rafia and her sister. Now, one of the main pieces of evidence against Rafia was that there was a magazine called Tehreek-e-Millat. Tehreek-e-Millat has never been banned by any government notification. It is not a banned magazine. And they said that, she is guilty of furthering the activities of Simi because we have recovered this Tehreek-e-Millat from her. And the Tehreek-e-Millat, how do we know that the Tehreek-e-Millat belongs to her? Because it's written in hand, Rafia. Now, very interestingly, that the same magazine, not even, it's the same physical magazine with Rafia written on it that appears in several cases, not only in Madhya Pradesh but also in Maharashtra. That's shown as recovery in ATS cases in Maharashtra also. And in fact, it is so widely used that Maharashtra ATS changes the name from Tehreek-e-Millat to Rafia Tehreek-e-Millat because they think that it's actually, that's the title of the magazine. So you have Rafia Tehreek-e-Millat appearing in several cases. It has been recovered in Mumbai train blast of 2006. It has been recovered in Simi case and has been submitted as evidence in the 2010 UAPA tribunal. Recoveries from Mohammad Najib Abdul Rashid Bakali and another Simi case, and also Malegaon blast case of 2006, which has been recovered, said to have recovered from one of the main accused, Nurul Hada. So, you can imagine not only the way in which evidence is fabricated, but the kind of close cooperation that we see between agencies across states. Often we see, newspapers will often do this, graphics you will see. In the center will be Dawood Ibrahim's old hat now, but in the center you will see some, Bhatkal brothers, one of those Bhatkal brothers, and then there'll be arrows going out, pointing to Azamgarh module, pointing to Kerala module, pointing to Odisha module, pointing to Maharashtra module, and so on and so forth. But if actually we were to just turn the tables around, we can see the kind of, linkages between these different agencies across states and how they are closely cooperating in manufacturing terrorists, in manufacturing evidence, and in creating, this whole thing about, there's so many terrorists all around. So what do you do? The UAPA, as you know, that when an organization is banned under UAPA, there's a tribunal which is supposed to, kind of adjudicate on whether the ban is reasonable or not, right? Now, in every 2 years now, of course, the law has been changed and it's been amended, and it's going to be 5 years now that the tribunal will sit. But so every 2 years, when the tribunal sits and Simi comes to contest the ban, which is another story because every time the state will say, but you don't exist, how can you come and contest it? So it's this, that, you have no locus standi, but if it doesn't exist, then you can't say that it's still engaging in unlawful activities. But it's like a kind of a, tautology, but we will ban you because you exist, but you cannot contest it because you do not exist. That's the kind of, logic that is produced in every tribunal. It's only in this last tribunal, I think this is the 8th or the 9th tribunal, where the judge actually said that, okay, you have locus standi. That locus being granted after 8 or 9 tribunals. Earlier, even the locus was not being granted by the tribunals. Now, what happens is that every 2 years the tribunal sits. So now the police from various states will come and say, they will submit their affidavits, the home departments of various states will come and submit their affidavits and say, sir, but you must ban, the ban on Simi must be extended because their activities are continuing. And as proof of those activities, we have these, 20 cases from Maharashtra, 30 cases from Madhya Pradesh, 15 cases from Rajasthan, 10 cases from Delhi, blah blah blah, and so on and so forth it goes. So it's like it's like a cycle. So you ban, and so therefore the ban gives you pretext to pick up more people, and when you pick up more people, create more cases, that gives you pretext to continue the ban. So it's like a vicious, cycle is created. And in fact, in one of the affidavits in the Madhya Pradesh case, placed before the 2010 tribunal, there's this investigating officer from Madhya Pradesh called B.S. Parmar, who gave a sworn affidavit saying that I arrested these people in Pitampur case. Pitampur case is one of the more high-profile cases of Madhya Pradesh. He says, I arrested these people and I found that I got their cell phones and I found these contact numbers and names in the cell phone. So I wrote to the police department of various districts saying, these are the people in your district who belong to SIMI, please take action against them. So after this letter goes out, about 18 or 19 cases are registered in different districts. So this is how, new cases are being registered. So now to come back to this, our Khandwa case, this is the kind of evidence that one sees is that, the witnesses are all sham. The recoveries are the recoveries that I've just mentioned, which are all over the place, everywhere. And yet, the court says that these people must be convicted under Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and convicts all of them except for one, and that one is on technical ground because the sanction for proceeding against him under UAP has not come even after the trial has ended. So that man has been in jail for 2-3 years. He was given bail after much haggling, and the sanction still doesn't arrive. So he's been acquitted, but the others, about 12 and 13, including Rafia and Asia, the sister, they're all convicted under UAPA with this kind of evidence. In fact, if we look at, it's true that, the other report, the Framed Damned Acquitted, looks at cases where acquittals have happened. And it's true that, there is a lot of vetting happening at the judicial stage. That of course the conviction rates are low, are not so high, which tell us something. But increasingly there's also a tendency or a trend that one can see. It's a very troubling trend, which is to use the idea of national security as some kind of an alibi for evidence, as long as, and one sees PPs, public prosecutors, arguing for it every time. In the Batla House case that we follow, every time the PP will say, oh sir, yes, we do not have evidence, but sir, this is a matter of grave national security. That these are hardened terrorists, these are, very tough terrorists, and, basically saying that don't ask for evidence, in terrorism cases. But sometimes what we are seeing is also that the courts are succumbing to this kind of, logic of national security and terrorism being such a great threat to our existence and sovereignty that we will let, the standard of evidence to be much lower. Now, in the Pitampur case, which I was just referring to, in that case, the police claimed that they had recovered some magazines from the farmhouse of the accused, and and they said that we had gone to his farmhouse and we had dug the ground and we found a sack buried under the earth, and we recovered these magazines from that sack, and which is definite proof of the fact that he's a very dreaded, kind of semi-operative. Now, the defense argued that there was no independent witness to the, the dragging of earth and the recovery of the sack and the magazines. Second, none of the magazines were banned by any government notification. Thirdly, none of them, even if they were not banned, there was nothing incriminating in it. They were just religious texts, basically. They were just religious texts. And and fourthly, even if they were problematic magazines, it did not link up the accused to any crime, to any act of violence or terror or any conspiracy. Now, to which let me just read you that line from, yeah. So the court says that the prosecution witness 24, BPS Parihar is the same guy who sent these letters off to various districts. In his cross-examination has refused the suggestion that this literature does not pertain to sedition but only to religion. This seems appropriate since there is jihadi talk about seeking revenge, and it also excites. I mean, the level of, you've just seen the level, the Mirza Ghalib's shairi being turned into, violent intimations of some conspiracy. Now, he says, now this judge says that this seems appropriate since there is jihadi talk about seeking revenge, and it also excites feelings against other community and class. It is clear and pernicious articulation of the ideology of the banned terrorist organization, and as such may be deemed to be banned, whether or not a notification to that effect has been issued or not. First he says that, okay, doesn't matter if it's been banned or not, it can be deemed to be banned. And then it goes on to say that, sure, there is no evidence in this case. But he says that in cases of terrorism, we cannot expect formal proof, and we should not desire formal proof either. These are the exact words of the judge, that we should not expect, nor should we desire formal proof in these cases. So that's, and it's not some isolated case. If you look at, UAPA is such that, of course, bail is very difficult, and no judge is going to, risk the collective conscience by granting bail to people who've been arrested on terror charges. But it is a fact that, if you talk to people who've been arrested under these charges, it's true that police is generally brutal, that DK Basu guidelines are not followed at all in any case, right? But what is happening is that with this whole question of terrorism coming in and this whole rhetoric of national security coming in, this kind of erosion of due process, which would otherwise be questioned, is given a kind of veneer of legitimacy. That it's okay, how else are you supposed to then fight terrorism? There are people like Praveen Swami who are writing that, okay, let's try out torture. We don't know whether torture works or not. Maybe we should try it out and see. How does one try it out and see? Conduct experiments on accused people, perhaps put them on machines and see how much pain they can take and how much, some kind of strange idea of trying out torture, to extract information about terrorism. So that's the kind of discourse that we are sort of, confronted with. Now, and in fact, if you talk to people who've been accused in these cases, all of them will tell you that when they were first produced before a magistrate after police custody, the judges and the magistrates refused to look at them in the eye, because then they would have to acknowledge that their bodies were bruised, that torture had been inflicted on them, and that they would either they did not want to recognize the fact that these people had been brutalized in police custody. And I just want to refer to this case in the Bombay train blast case, the 7/11. We want to put everything in these meta narratives. So 9/11, we must have our 7/11, then we must have 26/11. So these train bombings of 2006, 11 July 2006. If you follow, and I think the judgment is now reserved. We don't know, it might be pronounced, whenever. I believe the judge has got his daughters to get married or something. So the judgment will be pronounced any time, but we don't know what the judgment will be. But if you look at the way in which, it's one of the most sensational cases, serial bombings in first class compartments of suburban trains in Bombay, and then this happens on 11 July. By 13 July, all newspapers are reporting, which also brings us to the, how media is creating these narratives. So on 13 July, the police is claiming through the media that we've cracked the case, that there are these 2-3 people that we're looking for. Then it forgets about these 2-3 people. 3-4 days later, it produces 2 other people arrested, Kamal Ansari and somebody else, as the masterminds of the 7/11 bombings. That these are Simi men, and they fit the they're Muslims. They belong to a particular age, particular class, and so they must therefore be, who's going to question, especially in the media, who's going to question. So they are produced as accused. Between July and September, there's a series of arrests. I think about 13 or 14 people are arrested by the end of it. On 30th September, the Police Commissioner of Bombay holds a press conference and says that the ATS has done a remarkable investigation. It's first class, investigation, and he's very proud of it. And then in the press conference, he announces the details about how they cracked the case, what happened, and what is the entire conspiracy. So he talks about, in great and precise detail, he tells us that Simi and ISI collaborated on this, and how there were two pairs, one from Simi, one from ISI. They worked together to create these bombs. These bombs were then, RDX was got from Pakistan. Ammonium nitrate was procured locally by. This entire in detail story is, relayed to the media. That ammonium nitrate is procured locally by the Simi men. RDX is got from Pakistan by the ISI agent. And as proof of the ISI connection, they say, oh, there's this unclaimed body lying in the morgue. This guy must be Salim from Lahore. We don't know his address, but surely this is Salim from Lahore, who was the ISI in charge in this case. Now, and the commissioner also says that the bombs were created, they were packed in such a manner, and then they were placed in pressure cookers, which and he even gives the brand name of the pressure cooker, that they were Kanchan pressure cookers, which were planted in trains. And when these arrests are made, when these people are arrested, now between August and September, till the press conference happens, there are 5 remand applications filed before the Bombay High Court, in the court, in the magistrates court, and not one of them is turned down. And every time the ATS says, oh, but we need the remand because we are analyzing the call data records that we are looking at, because they were in. This is how the conspiracies will unravel. We know that they were in touch with ISI people through these phones, and so we need to analyze the call detail records, and we will just crack the entire case. So the impression was given that there were hectic investigations being taking place, and all of this was of course being dutifully reported by the press. If you look around, at newspapers between July, August, September, especially Bombay newspapers, you will find stories like how the 7/11 case was cracked. ATS discloses how ISI helped. These kind of headlines and stories you will find in plenty if you just Google search for news stories around that time. Now these men are put in jail. Now the case went on and on, and there was a 11,000 page charge sheet was filed in the court, in Makoka court. But interestingly, if you look through the 11,000 page charge sheet, there is no mention of call detail records. Not one mention of call detail records. It is not adduced as evidence, call detail records. There is no mention of pressure cooker, Kanchan pressure cooker, or any other pressure cooker. There is absolutely no mention. Instead, there are some black Rexine bags which make their appearance now. Now, these people continuously file an application in the court, the Kamal Ansari and Ehtisham Qutub and others, the other accused, saying that please give us our call detail records, because these will prove our alibi. They will prove us innocent. They will show the court that how we were neither present in the site of the bombings. They will prove that we were not in touch with anybody who is remotely related to any conspiracy. Now, the ATS said, but why should we give you the call detail records? We have not adduced it as evidence. We will only give you the material that we have used as evidence. And the Makoka court said, right, you don't need to give them material that will prove them innocent. You only need to give them material which will prove them guilty. That's the court saying. So twice this application got turned down. Then of course they went to the Bombay High Court, and the Bombay High Court took a very severe view of the ATS's and the Makoka court's reluctance to give these documents to the accused. But then the ATS said, oh sorry, but we don't have them anymore. We kind of destroyed them many years ago. So we don't have the call detail records. So sorry, we cannot give you anything which will prove your innocence. So, then the case went up to Supreme Court and so on. But even during the period of remand, we know what happened in the remand. This is just how to construct the story differently. If you look at only the press releases which were published by the news dailies as investigative reporting, which was basically they were just republishing the press releases of the police. But if you look at some other kind of evidence, for example, if you were to look at the letters that the accused sent out from jail, the first set of letters were sent out by Shahid Azmi, who was their lawyer at that time, and it is and if you Google for those letters, I mean, you will find them. They are such horrible, I mean, they describe such undescribable brutality. It's amazing that it is possible within the human imagination to think up of such cruelty. The kind of torture chambers that the ATS has devised, full of, the use of cockroaches, insects, screwdrivers, our own indigenous kind of waterboarding experiments. Perhaps this is what Praveen Swami wants to refer to as, experiments in torture. So, all of that. But also, and remember they will be charged under MACOCA, which allows confession to be, submitted as evidence. Now, apart from that, they also described how they were taken to the forensic science laboratory for their narco analysis tests. And several times, not just once, but several times. Once, a couple of times in Bombay, then they were taken to Bangalore, and the infamous Dr. Malini conducted the Dr. Narco conducted the tests on them. And I just want to read out from the CD of the narco test, because they were given the CD after, when they returned back to Bombay from the FSL. They were presented the CD and said, okay, this is what you said in your your narco test. Now, yeah. So the question is, how many bombs were planted? The answer comes from the accused: 7. The accused was stunned to discover that their questions had been doctored. They had been asked some questions and they had given answers to that, but the questions had been changed in the CD. So the original question had been, what comes after 6? He had answered 7. Then the second question was, who was involved in the conspiracy of the blast? Dr. Tanveer, Ehtisham, Faisal, Kamal Muzammil, Asif. The original question had been, who are the people in the cell next to yours? So he'd given Dr. Tanveer, Ehtisham, Faisal, Kamal Muzammil and Asif. So this is how, this kind of, and of course, I mean, if you look at how especially the stories like how 7/11 was cracked and so on appearing at that time, they all rely on the narco tests. All of them will say, the narco tests have revealed the entire conspiracy, the conspiracy is unfolded, they have confessed to their involvement, and they've told us how they paired with the ISI guys and so on and so forth. So this is how the narrative of guilt, narco tests are of course not admissible as evidence, but the fact is that they do help in creating a narrative of guilt. That, and by the time, and in fact if you look at all these news stories which appear, we can talk about this at length later also, but the news stories which appear, all of them appear before the charge sheets are filed. Right? So the person is arrested, and the period between charge sheet is filed, you will find all these, stories appearing about confessions, about the conspiracy unraveling and so on. So by the time the charge sheet is filed and by the time the poor man can apply for bail, the public, story is already built that he's guilty, he's admitted to his guilt. So this is the kind of, and of course these men write in the letters that, we told the magistrates that we are being tortured in the police custody, and yet 5 times the judge, accepted the applications for remand and sent them back to police custody to be tortured more. So, this is the kind of system that we are faced with. We have, judges who might look away when confronted by a tortured man. We have the media which shamelessly, builds on. In fact, in this report, Frame Down Equity, what we done was we discussed these cases, case 1, case 2, and at the end of each case, we had given the stories which had appeared in the press at the time of the person's arrest. So it gives us very interesting insight into the way, So this man, Imran Ahmed, who is supposed to have been a 9/11 kind of a conspirator, that he was supposed to have been doing some, flying course somewhere in Dwarka. Actually, he was living in Dwarka. He was arrested in Dwarka, and so every newspaper is full of stories about how he intended to fly a plane into one of the, the buildings in Delhi and create another kind of 9/11 in India. At the end of it, they just figured out that he hadn't even ever applied for a flying course. I mean, he had no connection at all with any flying corps, and the money that he had was, he borrowed some money from an uncle and he was going to return it, and that was, shown as some money for, hatching this conspiracy. So you have this media which builds its lies. You have the media. You have this kind of reportage, but you also have the security experts who are building their careers on creating these myths about these big terrorist organizations which are out to destroy India. Swami is one, but of course there are many others who indulge in this. So, and the latest entrant, of course, is the corporate sector. If you look at, and I'll just end with that, if you look at what happened after the horrendous carnage in Bombay, just days after the so-called 26/11, we have FICCI organizing a huge conference, first in Bombay, then in Delhi, involving all the big corporate leaders, and they bring out a kind of a blueprint. They give it's kind of an advisory which is meant for the government. And I just want to end by reading this from the FICCI Homeland, the FICCI task. It was called the FICCI Task Force report, which was brought out after the conference. So it talks about the war on terror cannot be won without sacrifice. National interest is paramount and should prevail over any other interests, even if they are constitutionally and democratically valid. That's the kind of, so you have the media, you have the judiciary, you have the agencies, but you also have this big corporate sector which is gunning for greater and greater securitization. It's not only about protecting, at that time, of course, there was a lot of hype around, the Bombay, all the hotels were targeted. So they felt that the corporate India was being targeted, but also the fact that there's a lot of money to be made out of the homeland security market. So there is this investment in so-called safe cities, smart cities. All of that is also very well paying. So so this whole narrative of counterterrorism also mixed up with this kind of technological fix that is being advocated by the corporates, and a kind of a techno security state is kind of staring at us in the face. I'll just end at that.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an insightful talk. We'll now be opening the floor to questions. Please keep your questions short and pointed and avoid cross-questioning.
Yes, ma'am. I was just wondering what you make of this kind of apologia that exists among the public, that the police is sort of forced to resort to fabricating evidence, it's forced to resort to torturing people, it's forced to resort to committing encounters because they're just so under-resourced. The police to population ratio is so low, they don't have adequate equipment, and this is why they have to do this to maintain law and order and control crime, because they don't have any other alternative. Do you think such a narrow economic approach really sort of gives a full picture of the problem, or does it completely gloss over the institutional and systematic prejudices that exist within and the kind of disproportionate burden of police brutality which is borne by marginalized communities?
Yeah, I completely agree with you that this economic logic is completely spurious. And also, if one were to look at counterterrorism especially, it is not conducted by a local neighborhood constable. It is by these very elite agencies who have inexhaustible resources, whose funding is not audited. We don't know how much, and IB especially doesn't have any, it doesn't even have statutory status for it to be under any legal mechanism. But even all these elite agencies these are not under-resourced or underfunded. They're in fact quite well funded, very well resourced. And if you look at, if you follow Special Cell on the side is making a lot of money. I mean, if you look at Rajbir Singh Gill gets bumped off because of some, nefarious land deal and so on. So I think this is just it's interesting that a lot of people who would otherwise say that, there is corruption in the police, who would cry about corruption in the police all the time, but when it comes to terrorism, they display such great faith in the very same police, So you had crowds who were ready to, pelt bottles and stones at the police during the December 2012 Delhi gang rape protest, right? The same middle class crowd would, would be gung-ho about a police operation against a terrorist. So I think at the heart of it is also what you said, the institutionalized prejudice that we fail to recognize and acknowledge. If you were to look at the marginalized communities, it's the interestingly even the NHRC. If you look at NHRC, the Indian government hasn't allowed the UN Special Rapporteur on summary executions and into India for a long time. It was only I think a couple of years ago when they were first allowed to come in, and they had an interaction with the NHRC. So they said, we've heard that there is this problem of fake encounters and so on. So the NHRC says, oh no, it's not such a big problem because the only people who were being killed is insurgents in Kashmir and Northeast, gangsters in UP and Bihar, and terrorists elsewhere. So this is the list of encountrables that even the NHRC subscribes to. And if you look at the community profile of all of these people, of course they come from the most marginalized section. So it is the institutionalization of prejudice that we see. There was this whole hullabaloo over, when Sushil Kumar Shinde said, that saffron terrorism. He made that remark about saffron terrorism in the Jaipur conclave of the Congress party, and there were, one panel discussion after another on national television about how can you equate terrorism with a religion, as though you never equated terrorism with religion at all. As though you're living in some kind of a, some strange planet that you are completely divorced from the kind of discourse that is happening. So suddenly saffron terrorism equates religion with terrorism, but otherwise it doesn't. And then if you were to follow those, I was looking at those panel discussions. So M.N. Singh, who was the investigating officer in the Black Friday blast, the Bombay blast of '93, he says, if I let me quote from him. He says that saffron terrorism is a politically coined terminology. It's very handy for some people to counter the charge of jihadi terrorism. In my opinion, there is nothing like saffron terrorism. It just doesn't exist in the Hindu pantheon. So this is after Samjhauta, this is after Ajmer Sharif, this is after Hyderabad, Mecca Masjid, and so on. So this absolute refusal to recognize or to acknowledge that there is this deep-seated bias and prejudice at the heart of not only terror investigations, but at the larger discourse of terrorism, which everybody, at least the middle-class public, very, has deeply sort of, internalized.